So it's likewise just as important to survey what has already been discovered and cataloged about a particular topic before ever starting a research project like this. As part of this proposal, I conducted a cursory literature review and would like to highlight some of those resources in particular. So this first slide shows here a snapshot of all the major subject areas being discussed and synthesized in this project. So, and I'll just go through and briefly summarize and discuss each one of these titles. So, starting from the top left, Confrontations with the Reaper is a very important document, a very important title on the value of death. It's an analysis on the concept of death and its inherent value itself. It was a really important and interesting read that I found. Going down to the bottom, this was a recommendation by Dr. Heiser concerning the Enochian worldview. It is a comprehensive dictionary on deities and demons in the Bible. It's a very important resource. Over on the right-hand side at the top is a dissertation on Waldensians, which was a proto-Protestant uh, group back in history and history of the church, and will also contribute greatly to the research. At the bottom right is a book by Michael Heiser titled Angels. This is a book about spiritual beings and will inform the research on the Enochian worldview. It is a treatise on the spiritual beings known as angels. And moving on, same pattern, top left. This book is actually an ancient manuscript, The Passions of Saint Perpetua and Felicity. It is a manuscript about a first-hand account of an early persecution in Rome and an actual a young woman who was martyred for the faith when she was thrown into the arena with the wild animals. Below that is a classic systematic theology by Schaeffer, and it has a section that details the angelic beings. Over on the top left, or top right, is another dissertation on the sons of God. It is specifically about Genesis 6 account and the divine council. On the bottom right, there is a text that was recommended and also the reading that I've undertaken. Between death and resurrection, it is a discussion on the intermediate state. So on the top left, this is a text approaching the end that discusses how to approach death and the afterlife. Bottom left is After We Die, which is a critical and philosophical analysis of death itself. On the top right is a dissertation on the sufferings in the Christian faith specifically, titled Man of Sorrows. Bottom right is an older text on Christian resistance. It's the theology of Christian resistance, and it's actually part of a series, I believe a 4-part series, on how to approach Christian persecution. On the top left is a text called God's Arrivals, which is an examination of the Enochian worldview and the gods of the nations other than Israel. Bottom left is a critical text of church persecution. It's called The Myth of Persecution, and it basically claims that the early church fabricated their claims of persecution and that there is no actual persecution of Christianity today. So that will be an interesting read. On the top right is a philosophical text by J.P. Moreland entitled The Soul, which is an analysis of what makes the individual, the I individual of the person, and the makeup of consciousness. Bottom right is The Global War on Christians, which is a text that reviews the state of Christian persecution in the world today. On this slide at the top left, we see the unseen realm, which is the text by Dr. Michael Heiser, which examines in detail the Enochian worldview and the gods of the nations. Bottom left is a text titled When We Die, was one of the first books I read on the subject, and this is a detailed analysis of death and what happens to the body when we die. Top right is the Theology of Persecution, and I got really excited when I discovered this book, and it is actually a detailed dissertation turned into a text, and it is an examination of the persecution throughout history and what that means for the church today. This text is actually not available for this project, but I do believe I think it's out of print, but I do believe the author of this book has created and released a lecture series, an audio lecture series, and that is available on the same subject. So the last text in this slide is When We Are Being Transformed, which was a recommended text, and it explores the concepts of the transformation between mortal and immortality. So as already alluded to, in David Barrett's World Christian Trends, the statistics are pretty clear concerning the increase in persecution against Christians on a global scale. In fact, Barrett asserts the claim that what we know as conventional denominational Christianity, what we see as Christianity today, will actually be utterly destroyed by 2025, just 4 years from now. That is kind of a shocking idea, and the question has to be asked: is that really possible? Is it possible that Christianity, as we've always known it, as we've ever known it in America, could utterly disappear? And the answer to that is really unclear and depends on a lot of different intersectioning confluences. More probable will be the extinction of not of the of Christianity itself in America, but maybe the distinction or the reorganization of the organized corporate Christian structure that we see. But we will see it be transformed fundamentally in both kind and purpose. The churches in the United States and many other parts of the world that are under a Western type of culture are predominantly asset-based organizations. So they have temple-like buildings, large infrastructures, many with multi-site campuses. These operate on massive endowments or cash reserves, much like seminaries that have been hijacked in America by progressive agents to redirect those funds to promote intersectionality. And that's really what we see why the church is being targeted, because of these assets that the church has, the church building, the church funds. This new godless religion wants to hijack those funds and those facilities, not only to remove power and influence from biblical Christianity, but also to take those funds and those assets and redirect them towards promoting their own godless religion. But as discussed in the work by Paulinard in his Theology of Persecution, this is neither unheard of nor unexpected. In fact, the church fathers spoke at length about suffering for their faith, and many of them lived it out in person. Aaron Kilborn, in his 2017 dissertation at Liberty University, compared the works of the early apologists on the use of their suffering and confirmed the ubiquity of persecution not only during the first 400 years of the church's history, but throughout its existence. This foundational history leads to what Berger called crypto-Christianity. In his article on the Catholic Spirituality website, Altalia, in 2019, this new term that he coined, crypto or crypto Christianity, simply repackages the long-held Christian belief of 2 Timothy 3:12, which states, "If you desire to live godly in Christ Jesus, you will suffer persecution." So this is not an unheard of or new concept for Christianity as a faith or as a religion or a way of life or an ideology. It is something that's just simply have been forgotten from the corporate consciousness of American Christianity. Now, there are a few graduate students, other than the ones that I've just mentioned, who have taken up this idea, such as Christy Solomon in her 2020 dissertation, Behind the Iron Curtain, where she wrestles with the impact of persecution on worship, where she asserts that the act of suffering for your faith has a profound effect on how a Christian will approach their worship and documents how worship is transformed by suffering, often from being externally focused, like we often saw in Christianity in the early 90s and the 80s in America, and to where it becomes refocused more on an inward and individualized spirituality after Christians suffer persecution. Tom Doyle points out that Christian persecution dramatically and drastically reshapes what it means to profess Christ. Rather than the light, momentary affliction present occasionally in the U.S. by increasing shifting cultural disenfranchisement of believers, many in other parts of the world have to make a daily decision between their fundamental faith and torture. So if they choose their faith, they are simultaneously choosing torture or martyrdom. That is a simple consequence of choosing the faith of Christ and professing, having a profession of Christianity. Of course, this leads to an important argument in this research: how a philosophy of death informs a theology of persecution. Since death is an universal equalizer, it is a fascinating phenomenon that American culture has shunned any genuine discussion of death at all. In fact, the topic of death itself has become a kind of cultural phobia, a proverbial boogeyman that Westerners, and specifically Christians in the U.S., have developed out of a fear and a terror of death rather than from a biblical foundation and understanding of death. The New Testament writers, though, saw no death for Christians. He who dies in Christ is dead in Christ, and that association rests in a promise of the resurrection and a seal of salvation. And to understand death, and for a philosophy pertaining to the nature and effects of death, an examination must be made on what constitutes life and what constitutes the human being. Rather than a monist view of of prevailing secular culture, which we have today in America, the Bible presents a trichotomic view of the person, specifically the body, the soul, and the spirit, that all three constitute the living being, or the she nefesh in Hebrew and the psyche in Greek. The secular view in America is encapsulated in the book Confrontations of the Reaper, which states, and quote, death is the annihilation of a functioning biological organism, end quote. Though Goetz, in his argument, would state that would argue against such physicalist kind of assertions. Now, J.P. Moreland, in his text, expressed identity in the context of experience, that in that, quote, experience is existence, end quote. Now, Goetz, in his brief history of the soul, goes further, stating that the mind is the equivalent of the brain, and if this is true, that then the brain is the equivalent of existence. So to have a brain equals to exist, since the mind and the brain are equal. Then to think it is to be is to do, so is to exist and have identity as a person. Yet McGinn argued that in his problem of consciousness, that such is not as cut and dried as it would be, as we would think concerning experience, since consciousness is in totality unobservable. So there's no way, like the activities of the brain, there is no way to measure consciousness or the activities of the mind. They are not equal in comparison. Now, to view the activity of the brain is in no way to view the activity of the mind, and there is no possibility of equating the mind and the brain together, since there is no exact correlation between the two. Further still, the research needs to address the why of persecution, the motivation behind increasing need for those in authority to exact suffering onto the other. This is why it is best established by an exploration of what has been coined the Enochian worldview, that there are supernatural beings behind the efforts of human will, which they lead and they guide and they deceive humans. This worldview was present during the Second Temple period, when the New Testament documents were being penned, and it is best exampled by Peter, Jude, Paul, and several apocryphal texts. The concept of the divine counsel of Psalm 82 will need to be explored, with events from Genesis 6 1 through 4 clearly in view. Now, this concept, though widely assumed in New Testament biblical times, was actually rejected by Augustine in his hopes of defending the faith with what became known as the Sethite view. Over the centuries, this has resulted in a kind of quasi-secular supernaturalism where, in America today, in our culture today, where the spiritual realms or spiritual beings specifically within those realms are discounted for human explanations. This has resulted in orthodoxy being grounded more on tradition rather than biblical exegesis. So a clearer understanding is needed for the foundations of reality that are not yet apparent in the narrative being provided by our society.